Hi, everybody. I think I'm live. This is awesome. I'm so excited to be here. Welcome to setting up your ancestor altar here at LlewellynCon2020. I'm so excited to be here. This is such an honor. My name is Patti Wigington, and I am the author of a super cool book coming out from Llewellyn in September. I believe the release date is September 8th, 2020, and it is called Badass Ancestors. Now, obviously, no one is interested in hearing me do a 30-minute commercial for my book. That's not why we're here. This is not a sales pitch. But I do want to tell you a little bit about Badass Ancestors because it was truly a labor of love for me. It's probably the most deeply personal thing I've ever created. So I've been practicing as a pagan and witch for a little over 30 years. I started when I was 18-ish, and I'm 51 now, so you can do the math. But I've been tracing my family tree for even longer than that. So over time, the research that I did about my own badass ancestors, the more I learned about them, the more I started to realize that it wasn't just about collecting a bunch of names and dates and places and just plugging them into a database. Instead, it was about learning the stories behind my kinfolk. It was about doing the research, learning what it was like in their world at their time. I learned about the places that they lived, and I'm a bit of a history geek, so this was totally my jam. I learned about the things they would have eaten, the political and social climate at their location. And it was about getting to know them on a much deeper level so that I could form relationships with my kinfolk. So while I never really set out to deliberately incorporate my ancestors into my spirituality, it just sort of evolved organically. And I began working with them as part of my practice. It's become the foundation of my spiritual practice on a regular basis. So how this book came to be was I was chatting one day on about genealogy on Facebook with Alicia Gallo, who's one of the amazing editors at Llewellyn Books. And I mentioned to her that I was kind of mapping out this book idea. And she said, well, let me take a look at it. And that's how Badass Ancestors was born. So the first part of the book covers some genealogy basics. How do you find your people? How do you identify who they were? Do I have to pay a whole lot of money to research my family tree? Plot twist, you don't. There's a ton of free resources available, and I actually list those in the back of the book. So that's the first part of the book, how to learn who they are and tell their stories. The rest of it focuses, though, on how to actually talk to your people, how to work with them, again, how to form those relationships, and ultimately connect with them for personal empowerment and spiritual growth and magical development. So you'll learn how to ask them for things like guidance, ask for their wisdom, ask for protection, even for assistance in matters of prosperity and financial success. Your ancestors want you to be successful. They want you to do well because that reflects upon the entire family. So I've found that one of the best ways to start working regularly with your ancestors, once you've figured out who they are, as part of your spiritual practice, is to give them a place in your home. And ideally, it's a permanent place if you can swing it, not just something you slam together when you need or want something from them. Having an ancestor altar isn't really something new. If you look at the history of cultures around the world, from the ancient Greeks to the ancient Romans, the Eastern societies in Japan and China, the various African nations, they've all venerated their ancestors and given them a place of honor in the home. So if you set up your own ancestor altar, you are carrying on a tradition that goes back hundreds, thousands of years. And it's beneficial to you for a number of different reasons. So first of all, having an ancestor altar gives you a place of focus for your work. When you pray to your ancestors, when you present them with offerings or do divination work, there's magic to be found in the routine and repetitive. That's why so often when we perform rituals, it's the same thing every time. There is a certain degree of magic that is part of that. So that altar can form the cornerstone of your ritual practice. Your people know where their spot is in your home because you've offered it to them. You've invited them in to be part of your world. The other thing having an ancestor altar can do is it confers a certain amount of protection on your home. Not just your home itself, but the people who live in it, because you're inviting the spirits of those loved ones who have passed on to be an active part of your life. you've given them that opportunity to work with you. So by extension, your home becomes their home, and they're going to watch out for it, and they're going to watch out for you and everybody who lives in this home. The other thing it does, having an ancestor altar gives you much greater access to information in the form of ancestral wisdom and experience. It gives you a place to start building those relationships with all the people you're connected to, whether it's by blood, marriage, adoption, or simply ancestors of the heart. So you've decided, you've figured out who your people are. Maybe you only gone a couple of generations back, but you want to get started. Okay, how do you set up an ancestor altar? That's the big question, right? What do you do with it? Well, the first thing you have to do is figure out where it's going to go. Where you put your ancestor altar is a uniquely personal decision. But ideally, it needs to be in a place where you're going to see it, where you're going to interact with it, where you're going to pass by it a few times a day. You could stick it in that back corner in that one unused room in the basement, but I guarantee you'll never pay attention to it. Out of sight, out of mind. Okay. My ancestor altar sits right there next to between my couch and my front door. I walk past it a dozen times a day. So put it in a place, if you have the ability and the resources, select a place where you're going to be able to engage with it. When you walk by it, you can give your people a shout out. Okay. Make it in a place that you can experience your ancestors' wisdom on a regular basis. There are some people who are uncomfortable putting an ancestor altar in a bedroom, although if maybe that's the only place you have any privacy, you might want to put them in there. I'm uncomfortable with that myself because, frankly, I don't want my great-grandmother looking at me during intimate moments, okay? If you put your ancestor altar in the bedroom, maybe keep a cloth to put over top of grandma and grandpa so they're not watching you during sexy time, because nobody wants that. One place you don't ever want to put your ancestor altar, though, don't put it in the bathroom. You wouldn't invite grandma over for a conversation while you're using a toilet, so don't invite your ancestors. You're like, hey, here's your house right next to my commode. Don't do that. It's just disrespectful. So find a place that is comfortable, that you would be equally comfortable inviting your living guests into. Make it a special spot in your home. And if possible, leave it up all the time. If you have small children or pets that might get into it, you maybe want to put it up someplace high or find a way to pack it up when necessary. But ideally, you want to leave it up as often as long as you possibly can. So what do you use, though? Well, your altar can be any available flat surface, and this is going to depend on your space, again, and it's going to depend on your resources. You can use any flat surface. You can use the top of a dresser, a coffee table, a shelf on a wall, an end table. My ancestor altar is actually an old IKEA bookshelf that I found on Craigslist. It was already assembled, so that was a good deal. And I tidied it up, and that is now my ancestor altar. Put it in a place where it's not going to be disturbed, though. That's the key. The spirits of your ancestors are going to gather there, and you want to be able to take the time to meditate with them. So it needs to be a surface where you can put all the things you need to use at any given time. The secret is you don't have to put all of your stuff on there all the time, okay? So before you actually get started, okay, you figured out where you're going to put it. You're figured out what you're going to use. Now what do? Well, you want to cleanse the space, just like any other magical activity. It's a really good idea to both physically and metaphysically cleanse the space. You wouldn't invite your grandparents over to visit you if your house was dirty, right? You want them to walk in and be like, this is so nice. I love what you've done with the place. It's so fancy. It's so tidy. That's how you want them to feel about the altar space, because that's their home. You're making them a home in your home. So give it a physical cleaning from top to bottom. Wipe down the space regularly. I like to just use a damp cloth and some lemon juice to wipe down my shelf, maybe get rid of any detritus that is blown in through the front door because it is right next to it. So clean the space physically. You also want to clean it metaphysically. And this is kind of a must. And you can do this by burning your favorite incense, whether it's a stick or cone incense, or if you have an herbal blend of loose leaf herb, that's my personal favorite. People use different kinds of herbs for metaphysical cleansing, cedar or sweetgrass, yerba santa, nagchampa. A lot of people are hooked on the idea of using sage, I actually don't recommend that for working with ancestors, because sage keeps stuff away. We don't want to push them away. We want them to feel welcome. My favorite, my personal choice, rosemary. I grow a ton of it, so I always have dried rosemary around, and it's associated with remembrance. And that's what this is about, is remembering these people who are so intricately connected to us. So I like to burn rosemary, but I'll just sort of pass it around. And if you want to ceremonially consecrate your altar as you set it up, you can just offer a simple incantation as you cleanse and purify it. I cleanse this space and make it sacred, and I welcome my ancestors to join me here. It doesn't have to be fancy. It can be simple. All right, you've cleansed your space. Now what do? Now you get to start putting stuff on it, and that's the best part. So you always want to start with an ancestor cloth, an altar cloth. And in some magical traditions, I know in a lot of the African traditional religions, the ancestor altar cloth is always white. I'm not a part of those traditions. So for me, I use things that are culturally and family relevant. My father's family, my dad was born in Scotland. So one of the things I sometimes use on my ancestor altar is I have a length of the McFarland plaid, the tartan that the clan used to carry and wear into battle. Sometimes I use plain black. Other times I have an unfinished, an unfinished quilt top that my late mother-in-law started before she passed away. I'll never finish the quilt top because I don't quilt, but I love putting it on the altar because it feels like it brings me closer to her. It helps me connect with her. Maybe your family came from a country where there are some unique textiles. Maybe if you have African ancestors, you might have a piece of kente cloth. If your people are from India, maybe you have your grandmother's sari. There's all kinds of beautiful fabrics from around the world. See if you can find something that connects you to your people and where they came from. You can use different ones depending on which ancestors you're working with at any given time. The key is whatever you decide to use as altar cloth, don't use it for other things as well, okay? If it's an altar cloth, it's an altar cloth. Let it stay special. Let it stay sacred, okay? What else do you put on there now that you've got the cloth on? Photographs. Love having pictures of my people on the altar. Now, a good rule of thumb is to only include photos of the deceased. If the only picture you've got of great-great-aunt Mildred is that photo of her holding you as a baby, use the magic of Photoshop and cropping and other things to remove yourself from the photo, because ancestor altars are for the dead. They're not for the living. Don't put living people on your ancestor altar. Now, what happens when you get back more than about 150 years ago? You probably don't have any photos of anyone who lived before then. It seems kind of weird because we live in a time where selfies are standard. We're always Instagramming ourselves with our besties and our whoever's. But that's a pretty new thing in the blip of humanity. So a long time ago, prior to the mid-19th centuries, people's likenesses were captured in portraiture. Maybe you have a painting or a picture of a painting that was done of one of your ancestors. Maybe you have a line drawing. If you had an ancestor who was famous or infamous, depending on how you look at it, maybe they were a queen or a philosopher or a scientist or a founding father. There may be artwork out there for you to choose from. So it never hurts to look for stuff like that. If you don't have physical images of your people, that's okay. There's a lot of other stuff you can put on there that's representative. Do you have a jar or urn of cremains from someone in your family who was cremated? Use that. I have a small jar for each of my maternal grandparents sitting on my altar. They sit side by side. They were married for over 60 years. They were together 6 decades in life, and I am certainly not going to be the one to tell them they have to be apart in death. I'd never hear the end of it. So they sit there side by side. What about soil from graves? Are you lucky enough to know where your people were buried? If you are, think about bringing home a small sample of earth from that gravesite. If you decide to do that, remember to do so. Be respectful. Don't be disruptive. Usually a spoonful of soil is sufficient. Offer your thanks when you take it. Maybe even leave a small offering as a token of goodwill for your people. What about family heirlooms? Heirlooms are great because those are things your people have touched. They handled them. Okay? Maybe there's that wooden bowl that was carved by a pioneer ancestor on a wagon train across the country, or a sewing kit that came through Ellis Island 150 years ago. A friend of mine has a silver fork that her great grandmother slipped into her pocket when she fled steerage and got into a lifeboat on Titanic. That is powerful, powerful magic right there. Okay, so think about family heirlooms. Water or other drinks. Okay, it's traditional to give your ancestors something to drink. And honestly, for me, hospitality is one of my love languages. So I'm all about, here's something to drink, here's something to eat, may you never hunger, may you never thirst. In some magical traditions, it's always water, and it might even be changed out every week on the same day. If that's something that is part of your tradition, then go for it. Maybe your people don't want water. That's okay. What about alcohol? My Scottish ancestors seem to really love a 21-year-old Glenfiddich. But my Norwegians like mead. So you can try something like that. If you don't want to offer alcohol, that's okay. What about coffee or tea or even chocolate drinks? Think about what might have been culturally relevant for your people at whatever time that they existed. There's also symbols. You can put symbols on your altar. Your ancestor altar is uniquely personal, okay? Add symbols of your family's heritage to your altar. I've got a dried thistle for my Scottish ancestors. I have a little Viking shield for my Norse heritage. I have a stone from the top of a German mountain. Maybe you have a flag from the country your people came from, or a musical instrument that's traditional in your family. Maybe you have a djembe from West Africa, or a set of pipes from Ireland, or a lute from Japan. Think about adding things like that. What about artwork? Do you have any artwork hanging above your ancestor altar? It's a great way to add some depth to the space, and it kind of brings it up and makes it more encompassing. Maybe you have a tapestry depicting the countryside of the motherland, whatever country it was they came from. Or if your people came from a country that has a specific design style. Australia's Aboriginal people have a very unique artistic style that's different from, say, the Indigenous people of Hawaii or the First Nations people of Canada. So think about stuff that's relevant to your heritage and maybe add a design like that into your altar space. Candles. Okay, we all love candles. You cannot shake a stick at a witchy convention without bumping into somebody who's like, I love candles. Candles work really well on your ancestor altar. So plan on including those. And there's a lot of room for different styles and needs here. Again, some magical traditions, it's always white and unscented. And if that's your jam, that's cool. But what if you have a grandparent who, let's say your great grandmother's favorite color was red, and she loved red so much that she's got pictures of herself wearing bright red Victory lipstick at the USO dances in 1941. If you find a candle in a color that matches Granny's bright red lipstick, you can use it. Maybe your grandfather was an avid fisherman and he always smelled like sunblock and salt water. And you just found a blue candle that smells like the ocean. It's okay to use it. Okay, think outside the box and think about what your family would appreciate. What would they value? Now, you can use different kinds of candles. I've found that tea lights and votives seem to work the best because they're small and you can put a lot of them into a very small space. You can either designate a candle to represent each individual ancestor that you're working with, or you can select one to represent each family group that you're working with. It's entirely up to you. Jar candles are a great option too. I love jar candles when I'm doing ancestor work because you can attach pictures to them, okay? If you have a printer, all you have to do is get some of the adhesive clear plastic and you can find a photo and boop, print it right out, slap it on a candle. If you're somebody who's lucky enough to have people in your family that you've identified that were canonized as saints, you might actually be able to find pre-made saint candles, which is kind of cool. I've never been Christian, I've never been Catholic, but I do have 4 Catholic saints on my ancestor altar because they're my people. They weren't canonized until a couple of centuries after their death, but they live over there. If I want to do something with them, I simply print and stick. Okay, let's talk about offerings. Okay, it's important to make offerings. And offerings are not you saying, "Hey, ancestors, if you do something for me, I'm gonna give you this offering in exchange." It's about showing your gratitude. It's about showing your appreciation. Again, part of developing that relationship. So it's important to think about what appropriate offerings are. And this is, remember, we were talking about getting to know your people and doing the research and learning who they were and what they would have liked. This is where it's going to come in really handy. You have to understand your ancestors in the historical and cultural context that they lived in. If your people came from a Scandinavian country, don't offer them a plate of fish if that fish is only found in the tropics. Okay? If Grandpa Joe really, really loved his coffee strong and black every morning for 80 years of his life, don't offer him a cup of Earl Grey loaded with cream and sugar just because that's what you like. Okay? Think about what your people would want, what would be appropriate. You can't go wrong with homemade baked goods. Again, food is my love language. So why not learn about the breads or dishes that would have been appropriate in your family's country of origin? Think about diving into ancestral cooking. Make things as close to what your people might have eaten as you possibly can, and share that with them. Present that to them and say, "I appreciate you. And to show you how much I appreciate you, here is my offering. Here is this bread I've created for you." Okay, there are other items you can put on your ancestor altar as well. I have a memory box on my altar. It's a simple wooden box that I decoupaged. And it's where I put memories of the most recently deceased people in my family. Now, normally in my family, we tend to live a really long time. We don't have a lot of deaths in my family on a regular basis. Last summer, I lost 2 family members within 3 days. So I ended up having to make a second box. But you can put things in there like photos or a clipping of the obituary or the funeral program or a rose that was on top of the casket. Those things can go in a memory box, and you can keep that there with your ancestors as well. Handcrafts that represent a family tradition. Did you have someone in your family who was a lace maker, a woodworker, a blacksmith? Create things that represent those and place those there in a position of honor. Divination tools. I do a lot of divination work with my ancestors. If you're working with a pendulum or tarot cards or oracle cards or scrying and you're asking your people for help, put that on there as well. There's all kinds of things that you can do. Whatever you decide to do, the key is to make your ancestor altar personal. Make it a place that's unique for both yourself and your kinfolk. Welcome them into your home. Give them a space that they can call their own. And you'll find that they're going to bless you with abundance and wisdom and all kinds of amazing things, protection and guidance, all because you took the time to get to know them and invite them into your life. Your ancestors are badasses, and they are waiting to speak with you. They have so much to share with you. So what are you waiting for? Get started. All right. We have a few minutes left, and it looks like it is time for some Q&A. This is my favorite part of doing these because people always ask me great questions, and they typically ask things that I never even would have thought about discussing. So I can't wait to see what we have. Okay. Andrea wants to know, what are your thoughts about ancestors about which we know almost nothing? I have German ancestors, among other nationalities, and about some I wonder what were they doing in World War II, or if they were Nazis. I know a bit about some of them, but not at all. Okay, that is a twofold question, and it's a good one. So if you have ancestors in other countries, first of all, before you get to those countries, start with the here and now, the today, and work your way backwards, okay? So let's say you have grandparents or great-grandparents who lived in other countries, which I get it, I do too. I hit a brick wall when I got to Germany and Hungary. You typically can find information about those people as long as it was documented. The trouble is, if you're an English speaker, like I don't speak any other languages than English. So when I find documentation written in German or Hungarian language or whatever, I can't decipher it. So in some of those cases, it's going to come in handy to find someone who is a native speaker of whatever that language is, because they can help you dive a little bit deeper. The second part of your question is, what if they were Nazis? That's a tough one. I actually spoke to someone not too long ago who discovered their grandfather was an actual card-carrying Nazi. That's what I would call a problem ancestor. And if you have one of those people in your family tree, the fact is there's nothing you can do about it. They exist there, but that doesn't mean you have to work with them. Okay. If you have someone who is a problem ancestor who has done horrible, horrible things, you can absolutely keep them away from your altar. When you call in your ancestors and you say, I call upon my ancestors, you can say, I call upon my ancestors, except for those 3 cousins in Germany who were Nazis. It's okay to exclude people. In fact, I wrote an entire chapter about problem ancestors and what to do with them. So if you've got somebody like that, or somebody who owned slaves, I mean, if you have people in your family who did horrible things, it's okay to choose not to work with them. That is entirely up to you. Okay, we have a couple of other questions. Susie wants to know, what if you know your ancestors, though loving, would not approve of pagan practice? Should we respect that and leave them out? That's an excellent question. So historically speaking, looking back through my own family tree, I'm probably the first pagan to come along in the lineage. I have ancestors who were, like I said, canonized as literal saints. I have some who were very highly ranked in the Christian church. They probably would not approve of pagan practice. However, I truly believe that they do approve of honoring one's family and honoring one's elders. If you have an ancestor that you're concerned might disapprove of what you're doing, ask them. It's okay to ask them. In fact, I think consent is pretty important when it comes to working with your ancestors. It's okay to say, are you guys comfortable interacting with me? Because historically speaking, just by virtue of numbers, most people in the past few hundred years have not been practicing as pagans like we are. Okay, most of my people, I come from a long line of very Christian people, but I've spoken with them and we've come to terms. So it's okay to ask them. If you truly feel like they're not comfortable with you doing what you're doing, set them aside and see if you can find somebody else to work with. Okay, let's see. Oh my gosh, so many good questions. Let's see. Anna says, what if they don't give consent? If they don't give consent, I wouldn't work with them. Consent matters. But the thing is, the more you trace your people back, I mean, you'll end up with thousands and thousands of people. I have 12,000 people in my database that I'm connected to either by marriage, by cousins, or by cousin marriage. And even though there are a couple that have made it clear that they're not interested in working with me, there's plenty of others for me to choose from. Gwen says, I personally have found that the ancestors will leave if you are having an intimate situation. They are around me much of the time wherever I am anyway. Yes, like I said, if you have your ancestor altar in your bedroom, you know, that's entirely a matter of choice. I don't want to be looking over at my grandparents' faces during intimate moments. Let's see. Letitia wants to know, what is your opinion of an ancestor altar that is dedicated solely for female ancestors, the mothers, if those are the ancestors we are most drawn to, and some others might be more drawn to the male ancestors or the fathers? Absolutely. If you come from a long line of strong, powerful, badass women, give them an altar space. It is absolutely okay. There are so many different ways you can set up your ancestor altar, and you can put on it whichever group of people you like. There might be one branch of the family that's too much drama and too much trauma, and you can put those people aside. Maybe you don't connect to the men in your family and you want to honor the sacred feminine. Have an ancestor altar strictly devoted to the mothers. Maybe you connect to the men. Have one focused on the sacred masculine. It's entirely up to you. It's such a uniquely personal thing. But find a way to connect whichever group resonates with you the most powerful. Teresa wants to know, what if you can only go back 2 generations? Well, we all start by going back 1 generation, and then we go back 2 generations. And then that's where the research starts, and that's where you have to dive in. It can be a challenge. There's a lot of free information out there, and there's a lot of information you can find if you're willing to pay for it. But a lot of times the work has already been done. The trick is you just have to find out who's already done the work and how good their research was. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up soon. It looks like we have time for one more question. Someone else whose name is also Patti with an I, hey, name sister, wants to know, how did I begin my search for ancestors? So quick story, when I was about 15, my family was sitting down to dinner with my great-great-grandparents. My great-great-grandmother was certifiably crazy, and she was spiteful. And my mom and I had discovered that a couple of family members had died on the same day in April of 1892. And we thought that was really weird. So we brought it up at dinner, and we didn't know, maybe there was a carriage accident or a fire or an outbreak of cholera. So we asked about it, and she blurted out, no, he killed her. Then he killed himself, passed the gravy. That was how I got started. Turned out she wasn't just being spiteful. It was true. I have the newspaper clipping. So I think that is it. We're going to wrap up. Thank you all so much for being part of this with me today. I had such a great time. Thanks to Llewellyn Books for letting me be part of LlewellynCon2020. Can't wait to see you guys for the next one. Thanks again. Have a great afternoon, you guys.